The palace of Empress Salith Kovan floated above a city made of light, held in the sky by forces that most species in the galaxy could not even begin to understand, and from every angle it looked like a living crystal that breathed and hummed with ancient power. She was tall, even by the standards of the Valithi, standing nearly 9 feet, with skin that shimmered like cracked diamond, and eyes that burned with the pale blue fire of a dying star. And when she walked through the corridors of her floating palace, the walls themselves seemed to bow in recognition of her presence. 40 star systems answered to her voice, and the Galactic Concord, that fragile web of treaties and promises that kept 100 species from tearing each other apart, held together largely because she willed it so. But none of that mattered tonight. Tonight, the most powerful being in the known galaxy knelt on the floor of her private chamber, with tears streaming down her crystalline face. And in her arms she held a small creature that was dying. The creature was called a Mirashki, and its name was Nyx. Nyx was small enough to fit in the crook of the Empress's arm, covered in soft dark fur that shimmered with streaks of silver. And it had 6 legs that usually moved with a lazy grace that made it look like it was always stretching after a long nap. And its eyes, normally bright with a warm bioluminescent glow, were dim now, flickering like candles about to go out. To most species in the galaxy, a Mirashki looked strange, even unsettling. Too many legs, too many teeth when it yawned, fur that moved on its own as if breathing. But to anyone from Earth, it would have looked like something impossibly familiar. Because Nyx purred when it was happy, and it kneaded with its front paws when it felt safe. And it curled into a ball on the Empress's lap during long council sessions. And it headbutted her chin when it wanted attention. Was scared. It hid under the nearest piece of furniture and refused to come out. Nyx was, by every behavioral measure that mattered, a cat. And now Nyx was broken. 3 hours earlier, a terrorist attack had struck the eastern wing of the palace, a faction of separatists who wanted the hegemony to collapse, who wanted the Empress to fall, who planted charges in the energy pylons that held the palace aloft. The attack had failed, mostly, but one pylon had collapsed inward before the shields could compensate, and a cascade of debris had torn through the Empress's private garden, where Nyx had been sleeping in a patch of artificial sunlight. The creature had been found beneath a slab of crystal and metal, barely breathing, its body twisted in ways that made the Empress's guards look away. Internal bleeding, the royal physician said, and fractured limbs in at least 3 places, and severe damage to the bioluminescent neural glands that ran along its spine. Glands that were connected directly to its nervous system. The Valithi physicians were brilliant, but their medicine was designed for Valithi bodies, crystalline structures, energy-based circulatory systems, psychic tissue repair, and they had no framework for treating a creature made of flesh and fur and fragile little bones. They told the Empress they were sorry, and she screamed at them until the walls cracked. Because Nyx was not just a pet. Among the Valithi, the Mirashki were sacred, onded companions chosen once in a lifetime through a deep psychic ritual that tied the animal's emotional state to the soul of its partner. And Nyx had been bonded to Salith since she was a young princess, decades before she took the throne. If Nyx died, the bond would shatter, and the psychic backlash would send the Empress into a spiral of grief and madness that could last years or forever. The advisors knew what that meant. It meant the hegemony would suffer, lose its Empress, and without her, the Concord would fracture. And without the Concord, the old wars would start again, and billions would die in conflicts that had been sleeping for generations. All because of one small furry creature bleeding out on a velvet cushion. The Empress issued a priority Omega summons within the hour. the highest level of diplomatic emergency, reserved for events that threatened the stability of the galactic order, and she broadcast it to every allied species in the Concord. The message was simple. The Empress's bonded Mirashki was dying, and she needed someone who could save it, and she was calling in every favor and treaty and debt that had ever been owed to the Violathi throne. The responses came quickly. The Galari Hive Collective acknowledged the summons and dispatched a delegation of their finest bioengineers within minutes, their insectoid ships cutting through space with mechanical precision. The Draloon Communion sent a team of psychic healers from their deep ocean world, beings who could feel pain across star systems, and who had once healed a dying sun. Or so they claimed. The Torvasians, cold, silicon-based logicians, who believed everything could be reduced to mathematics, sent their top medical statisticians, along with a formal note expressing their confidence in a data-driven solution. Even the Ymiri, the ancient herbivore philosophers who rarely left their homeworld anymore, sent a pair of elder sages to offer what they called wisdom in the face of loss. Ships began arriving at the Violathi capital within hours, filling the orbital docks with vessels from across the galaxy, each one carrying the best minds their species had to offer. The Empress watched them arrive from her chamber window, Nyx cradled against her chest, the creature's breathing so shallow now that she had to press her ear against its fur, just to make sure it was still alive. "On," she whispered, her voice cracking like breaking glass. "They are coming, and someone will know what to do, and you are going to be fine." But deep in her chest, in the place where the psychic bond lived and hummed like a second heartbeat, she could feel the thread growing thinner. And she was afraid. The delegations would arrive by morning, and the Empress told herself that one of them, surely one of them, would look at Nyx and know how to fix what was broken. She had to believe that, because if no one could save Nyx, then nothing else in her empire mattered at all. The first delegation arrived at dawn, and the Empress had not slept. She sat on the floor beside Nyx, who lay on a cushion surrounded by Violathi monitoring crystals that pulsed with faint light every time the creature's heart managed another weak beat, and the intervals between those pulses were growing longer. The Royal Medical Pavilion had been cleared of everything except what was needed, and guards lined the walls, and the air itself seemed to hold its breath as the Golari delegation entered. There were 5 of them, tall insectoid beings with segmented bodies covered in plates of dark chitin, and their compound eyes reflected the room in 1,000 fractured images, and they moved in perfect synchronization, as if controlled by a single mind, which in a sense they were. The Golari were hive engineers, the finest biological architects in the galaxy, capable of growing entire cities from living tissue and rewriting the genetic code of organisms the way other species might edit a document. The lead Golari, designated Speaker 9, approached the cushion where Nyx lay and extended a series of thin sensory tendrils that scanned the creature from head to tail. The examination took exactly 4 minutes. Speaker 9 retracted its tendrils and turned to the Empress with an expression that was impossible to read on an insectoid face, but somehow still managed to communicate complete indifference. "The organism is singular," Speaker 9 said, its voice a dry clicking sound translated through a device on its thorax. "It possesses an individual consciousness untethered to any collective network, and our medical frameworks are designed for hive-integrated biology, and we cannot treat what we cannot connect to." The Empress stared at the Golari, and the cracks in her crystalline skin spread another inch. "You are telling me," she said slowly, "that you will not try." "We are telling you that the attempt would be meaningless," Speaker 9 replied. "The creature's biology is too individualistic for our methods, and we do not waste resources on procedures that have no hive benefit." They left without another word, their footsteps clicking in perfect unison against the pavilion floor. and the Empress watched them go, with a fury that made the air around her shimmer with psychic heat. The Draloon arrived next. They were beautiful in the way that deep ocean creatures are beautiful. Translucent skin that rippled with colors, long flowing limbs that moved as if they were still underwater, and large dark eyes that seemed to hold entire oceans of empathy inside them. The Draloon were psychic healers, perhaps the most gifted empaths in the galaxy, capable of reaching into a patient's mind and soothing pain at its source, rewriting neural pathways, calming storms of trauma and agony with nothing but focused thought. Their lead healer, a being called Thessaly, who spoke in a voice like waves against sand, knelt beside Nyx and placed one translucent hand above the creature's head, and immediately pulled back as if burned. "The mind," Thessaly whispered, eyes wide. "It is chaos, pure raw unstructured emotion, fear and pain and something wild that we have no name for. It is like trying to hold fire in water." "Then hold harder," the Empress said through clenched teeth. Thessaly shook her head slowly, and genuine sorrow moved across her translucent face like clouds across a sky. "If we attempt to interface with this creature's mind, the psychic feedback could damage our healers permanently," she said. "Its consciousness is too primal, too alien to our methods. We heal for structured psychic resonance, and this creature's mind has no structure. It is all instinct and feeling and something fierce that we do not understand." "It is not fierce," the Empress said, her voice breaking. "It is frightened." The Draloon were already retreating, their flowing limbs carrying them backward with visible discomfort. And Thessaly paused at the door long enough to say, "We are truly sorry," before they disappeared. The Torvasians came next, and they did not even bother with empathy. 3 silicon-based beings entered the pavilion, with tall, angular creatures that looked like living statues carved from obsidian, with glowing lines of data streaming across their surfaces like veins of molten light. They scanned Nyx remotely, using devices embedded in their own bodies, ran the data through probability matrices that processed millions of variables in seconds, and then projected their findings as a holographic display in the center of the room. Survival probability given available medical frameworks, 14.3%, the lead Torvasian announced, in a flat tone that held no warmth at all. Factoring in the unknown variables of Mirashki neural gland repair, probability drops to 7.1%. And factoring in the reputational damage to our medical institutions, if the procedure fails on a creature bonded to the most powerful monarch in the Concord, the risk-reward ratio becomes unacceptable. The Empress stood up slowly, and the floor beneath her feet began to crack. "You are refusing because of your reputation," she said. "We are refusing because mathematics does not lie," the Torvasian replied. "We recommend you accept the natural terminus of the creature and begin preparing for the psychic transition." They left, and the Empress did not scream this time because she was beyond screaming. The Emiri were last. 2 ancient beings entered the pavilion, massive but gentle herbivores with moss-covered hides and eyes that held the patient wisdom of a species that had been old when most civilizations were still learning to make fire. They looked at Nyx for a long time without speaking, and then, elder of the 2 settled onto the floor with a sound like a mountain sighing, and began to speak in a voice so deep it vibrated in the bones. "All living things are born, and all living things return to the great silence," the elder Ymiri said. "This is not tragedy, but completion, the circle turning as it must. And we would counsel you, Great Empress, to sit with your companion in its final hours and meditate upon the beauty of the time you shared, rather than rage against the turning of the wheel." The Empress's psychic fury hit the walls of the pavilion so hard that every crystal in the room shattered simultaneously, and the Ymiri flinched for the first time in perhaps a century. "Get out," the Empress whispered, and the words carried the weight of a collapsing star. They got out, The pavilion was empty now, except for the Empress and Nyx, and the guards who stood frozen against the walls, afraid to move, afraid to speak, afraid to breathe too loudly, near a monarch who was visibly falling apart. The cracks in Salith's skin had spread across her arms and up her neck, and faint light leaked from between them, like blood from wounds, and everyone in the room knew what it meant. The psychic bond was fraying, and when it snapped, the Empress would be lost. A junior aide, a young Valithi barely old enough to serve at court, stepped forward on trembling legs, and spoke in a voice so small it was almost swallowed by the silence. "Your Majesty, there is one species we have not contacted." The senior advisors turned to look at the aide with expressions that ranged from confusion to contempt. "The humans," the aide said. The room went very still. "They are young," one advisor said dismissively. "Barely spacefaring. They joined the Concorde less than a decade ago. They are reckless and emotional, and they solve problems by throwing themselves at them until something works," another added. Aide swallowed hard, and looked at the floor, and then looked up again with something desperate in her eyes. "They are the only species in the galaxy known to perform surgery on other species' companion animals," she said quietly. "Sometimes for no payment at all. They just do it because something is hurt, and they cannot stand to watch it suffer." The room was silent for a long time. The Empress looked down at Nyx, whose bioluminescent eyes flickered once, barely a spark, and then went dark again. "Contact the humans," the Empress said. The UMSS Florence was not an impressive ship. It was a small human medical frigate, with a hull that had been patched so many times it looked like a quilt made of metal, and its engines made a sound that the chief mechanic described as "mostly fine," and the words United Medical Service were painted on its side in letters that were starting to peel. It drifted beside a refueling station in the Carvet system, 3 star systems away from the Valithi capital. And inside its cramped medical bay, a woman was elbow-deep in the belly of a creature that looked like a lizard had tried very hard to become a dog and given up halfway through. "Easy, buddy," Dr. Lena Vasquez muttered as the creature hissed at her. "I know it hurts, but if you keep squirming, I'm gonna accidentally remove something you need." She was 40 years old, with dark hair pulled back in a messy knot, and tired eyes that had seen too many long nights, and hands that were steady, even when the rest of her was not. And she wore a surgical coat that had been white once, but was now a constellation of old stains that told the story of every alien animal she had ever treated. The lizard dog belonged to a cargo pilot named Fen, who sat in the corner of the medical bay, looking like he might pass out. "Is he going to be okay?" Fen asked for the 4th time. "She," Lena corrected without looking up. "And yes, it is just a blocked intestinal valve, common in her species when they eat too much synthetic protein. What have you been feeding her?" "Just the standard cargo rations. Those are for you, not for her. I will write you a dietary guide before you leave." She finished the minor procedure, cleaned the wound, applied a bioadhesive patch, and gently set the creature back on its feet, where it immediately wobbled over to Fen and tried to climb into his lap. Lena smiled, the tired kind of smile that came from doing this work every day on a ship that was falling apart, with a crew of 4 and a budget that could barely cover fuel. She washed her hands in the small sink, and that was when the comms officer, a young man named Desh, who also served as the navigator and the cook, burst through the door with an expression that suggested the ship was on fire. "Doc," he said, "we just received a priority Omega summons." Lena looked at him with one eyebrow raised. "A what?" "Priority Omega, from the Valithi Empress herself, the actual Empress, Salith Kovan, ruler of 40 star systems." Lena stared at him for 3 full seconds. "Is this a joke?" she said. "Because if Raj put you up to this, I swear I will reassign him to waste recycling for a month." "It is not a joke," Desh said, and he held up his datapad with hands that were shaking. And on the screen was the official seal of the Violathi hegemony, a crystal starburst that pulsed with light that was impossible to fake. Took the pad and read the summons in silence. The Empress's bonded Murashki was dying. Internal bleeding, fractured limbs, neural gland damage. And every major species in the Concord had been contacted. And every one of them had either refused or failed. And this was a final request to any qualified xenobiological medical practitioner who could reach the Violathi capital within standard transit time. Attached to the summons were biological scans of the creature. Lena opened the scans and studied them, and the rest of the room watched her face change. First confusion, then recognition, then something that looked like a door opening in her mind. "Desh," she said quietly, "what does this look like to you?" Desh leaned over and squinted at the scan. Some kind of alien mammal. 6 legs, weird glowing bits along the spine. "I do not know, Doc. It looks like a cat," Lena said. She said it with such certainty that Desh, "A what?" "A cat. Look at the skeletal structure if you ignore the extra limbs. Look at the organ placement. The heart is in almost exactly the same position as a domestic cat. The liver, the kidneys, even the intestinal layout. This is convergent evolution on a scale I have never seen before." She was already moving, pulling up files on her datapad, cross-referencing the Mirashki scans with Terran feline anatomy charts she kept in her personal database. Because she kept anatomy charts for every Earth animal. She always had, ever since veterinary school. "The neural glands are new," she muttered, scrolling fast. "Nothing like that in Terran cats. Bioluminescent structures tied directly to the nervous system. But the underlying nerve pathways are similar enough that I can map them." She looked up and her eyes were different now, focused in a way that made Desh take a step back, because he had seen that look before, and it meant Dr. Vasquez had made a decision, and the universe could either help or get out of the way. "Prep the surgical bay," she said. "Full sterilization, pull out the microsurgical kit, and the backup kit. And someone find me every piece of published literature on Mirashki physiology. I want it downloaded before we jump." "Doc," Desh said carefully, "are you serious? This is the Violathi Empress. If something goes wrong, then something goes wrong, and I deal with it," Lena said. "But right now there is an animal dying on a cushion 3 systems away, and I have the skills to help it. And I am not going to sit here and pretend that is not true. We jump in 20 minutes. The Florence lurched into faster-than-light travel 18 minutes later, because Lena's crew had learned long ago that when she said 20 minutes, she meant it. During the transit, Lena locked herself in the medical bay and studied without stopping. She pulled up every scrap of data on Mirashki biology she could find, and there was not much. The Violathi were protective of information about their sacred companions. But what she found confirmed her initial assessment. And the more she looked, the more the similarities stunned her. Across the galaxy, on a world made of crystal and light, evolution had produced an animal that purred when it was content, and hissed when it was scared, and curled into the laps of those it loved. She contacted her old professor at the veterinary college on Earth, Dr. Amara Ose, a 70-year-old woman who had been retired for a decade, but still answered calls from former students at any hour. "Amara," Lena said, when the quantum link connected, "I need your help." "Lena, it is the middle of the night here." "I know. I am about to perform surgery on an alien creature that is basically a cat. A cat with 6 legs and glow-in-the-dark neural glands, bonded to the most powerful monarch in the galaxy, and I need you to help me plan the procedure using a standard feline surgical framework modified in real time." There was a long pause. "You are joking," Amara said. "I am not joking even a little bit." Another pause, and then Lena heard the sound of a lamp being turned on and a chair being pulled up to a desk. "Send me the scans," Amara said, and Lena could hear the old woman smiling. They worked through the entire transit, 3 hours of intense planning, mapping the Mirashki's internal structure against domestic cat anatomy, identifying where the biology matched and where it diverged, building a surgical plan step by step. When they were done, Amara said something that stuck with Lena. "You know why you are the right person for this, Lena?" Lena did not answer, but she knew. She was 12 years old when the fire took her family's house, and she made it out because her mother carried her. But her cat, a small orange tabby named Miso, who slept on her pillow every night, did not make it out. And Lena had stood on the lawn screaming while firefighters held her back. And she had never forgiven herself for not going back in. She became a veterinarian because of Miso, and she became a xeno-veterinarian because she decided that if the galaxy was full of creatures that needed help, she was going to help as many of them as she could. She had never turned away a wounded animal. She never would. The Florence dropped out of faster-than-light travel above the Velithi capital, and the planet filled the viewport with impossible beauty. Towers of crystal rising from oceans of liquid light, and the floating palace above it all like a jewel suspended in the sky. Lena stood at the viewport and looked down at this world that was nothing like Earth and everything like a dream. And she took one deep breath and let it out slowly. "All right, Nix," she said to no one. "Let us see what you have got." The Royal Medical Pavilion smelled like ozone and grief. Lena walked through the tall doors, flanked by Velithi guards, who towered over her by nearly 4 feet, and her boots made small sounds against the crystal floor that echoed in the enormous space. And every eye in the room turned to look at her. This small, tired, unremarkable human woman, carrying a battered medical case in one hand, and a second bag slung over her shoulder. The Empress stood at the far end of the pavilion, surrounded by advisors and attendants, and she looked like a statue of a goddess that someone had taken a hammer to. Her crystalline skin cracked in a web of fractures that leaked pale light, and her eyes burned with a desperate fire that made the air around her shimmer. Lena was supposed to bow. Every species that approached the Velithi throne was expected to perform the formal greeting, a deep bow, followed by a recitation of titles that could take several minutes, depending on the occasion. Lena did not bow. She walked straight past the advisors, straight past the guards, straight past the Empress herself, and she went directly to the cushion where Nix lay, surrounded by monitoring crystals. The entire court held its breath. Lena set down her bags and knelt on the floor beside the creature, and for a moment she just looked at it. This small broken thing with dark fur and too many legs and dim eyes that had once glowed with light. Then she reached out and very gently scratched behind its ears. It was such a simple gesture, so instinctive, so natural, so deeply human, that it seemed almost absurd in the grandeur of the Violethi royal court. But something extraordinary happened. Nix, who had been hissing and lashing at every alien physician and healer who had come near it for 2 days, who had bitten a Galari tendril and scratched a Draloon empath and refused to let anyone touch it, opened its dim eyes and looked at Lena, and it began to purr. The sound was weak, barely a vibration, but it was there. A sound that had not been heard in the pavilion since the attack. The Empress made a noise that was not quite a gasp and not quite a sob. The advisors stared with expressions of pure disbelief. Lena continued to scratch behind the creature's ears, moving her fingers slowly to the spot just under the jaw, where if this animal was anything like the cats she had grown up with, the good nerves were. Nix leaned into her hand. "How?" the Empress whispered, stepping forward. "It has not let anyone near it. How are you doing that?" Lena looked up at the Empress and spoke in a voice that was calm and warm and carried the weight of 10,000 years of a bond that had nothing to do with psychic rituals or sacred traditions. On our world, we have lived alongside creatures like this for a very long time, she said. We know how to make them feel safe. Turned back to Nyx, and her expression shifted. The warmth remained, but it was joined now by focus, by the sharp clinical attention of a surgeon assessing a patient. Okay, little one, she said softly, I am going to take a look at what is going on inside you, and I need you to trust me. And I know that is a lot to ask, but I promise I am going to be very gentle. She opened her medical case and began to work. The surgical preparation took 40 minutes, during which Lena transformed one corner of the royal pavilion into something that resembled a field hospital. Sterile drapes laid out with military precision, instruments arranged in the exact order she would need them, monitoring equipment calibrated and cross-referenced with the Veilithi crystals that tracked Nyx's vitals. Her crew, Desh, a surgical nurse named Priya, and the ship's medic Raj, worked around her in practiced silence, each of them slotting into their roles with the efficiency of people who had done this 100 times in worse conditions. The Veilithi court watched all of this with a mixture of fascination and confusion, because the humans did not move with the cold precision of the Galari or the flowing grace of the Draloon. They moved like people who cared, quickly and urgently, bumping into each other and muttering apologies and adjusting on the fly. The Empress had ordered a galaxy-wide holofeed of the procedure, partly because transparency was expected during a priority Omega event, and partly because she wanted every species that had refused to watch what happened next. Somewhere in the Galari collective, 1,000 compound eyes turned to their screens. In the deep oceans of the Draloon homeworld, empaths gathered in viewing chambers and reached out with their minds toward the distant signal. On the Torvasian homeworld, statisticians opened new probability models and began to calculate. Lena administered the anesthetic, carefully measured dose based on feline body weight ratios adjusted for Mirashki physiology. The kind of calculation that would have taken the Torvasians an hour, but which Lena did in her head based on 20 years of experience. Nyx's eyes fluttered closed, and the purring stopped, and the pavilion went silent. Lena picked up her first instrument. Starting now, she said. The surgery was brutal. 7 hours of work inside a body that was both familiar and foreign. Organs in almost the right places but not quite. Blood vessels that branched in patterns she had to map in real time. Tissue that responded to her instruments in ways she had to adapt to on the fly. The internal bleeding was the first priority. A ruptured vessel near the spleen that was slowly filling the abdominal cavity with dark fluid that smelled like copper and something sweet that had no earth equivalent. She clamped it, sutured it, checked it twice, and moved on. Fractured limbs were next. 3 of the 6 legs had breaks, 2 of them compound, and she set each one with a combination of human bone pins and Veilithi crystal splints that Priya fabricated on the spot, using the palace's medical printers. But the real challenge was the neural glands. They ran along Nyx's spine like a string of tiny stars, bioluminescent organs connected directly to the nervous system, unlike anything in Terran biology, and 3 of them had been crushed by the debris. Lena had never seen organs like these before, and there was no manual for this, and if she damaged them further, she could destroy Nyx's neural function permanently. She paused, stared at the glowing structures through her surgical magnifiers, and thought. Then she called up the scans she had studied during transit and overlaid them with what she was seeing, and she found the pattern. The glands were wired into the nerve pathways the same way that certain ganglia connected to the spinal cord in Terran cats, and if she treated them like inflamed nerve clusters, she could reduce the swelling and stabilize them without invasive repair. She worked on the glands for 2 hours, and her hands did not shake once, and she talked to Nyx the entire time, even though the creature was unconscious, a habit she had picked up in veterinary school and never broken. You are doing great, Nix. This gland here is a little swollen, but it's going to be fine. I just need to ease the pressure, and let your body do the rest. You are tough, I can tell. You have got that look about you, that look that cats get when they have decided they are not done yet. On the Draloon homeworld, an empath named Thessaly watched the holofeed, and reached out with her mind across the void, and touched Lena's emotional state from light years away. What she felt made her weep. The human woman was terrified, absolutely, completely, bone-deep terrified, hammering, and her stomach was in knots, and every part of her brain was screaming that she was in over her head. But she had not stopped. She had not even slowed down. On the Torvasian homeworld, the lead statistician watched the probability models update in real time as each stage of the surgery succeeded, and the survival percentage climbed from 14 to 20 to 31 to 47. And for the first time in its silicon existence, the Torvasian felt something it could not quantify. Then, in the 6th hour, Nix's heart stopped. The monitoring crystals went dark, and Priya called out the flatline in a voice tight with controlled panic. And every screen on every world showing the holofeed displayed the same terrible straight line. Lena did not hesitate. She placed both hands on Nix's tiny chest, this chest that was barely bigger than her 2 palms put together, and she began manual cardiac compression. Press, release, steady, rhythmic, precise. The way she had been taught in medical school, and the way she had practiced on models, and the way she had done once before on a dying cat in a shelter on Earth when she was 23 years old and still believed she could save everything. 30 seconds and nothing. 60 seconds and nothing. 90 seconds, and Desh said "Doc" in a voice that meant it might be time to stop. 120 seconds, and Lena did not stop, and she leaned close to the small dark creature and whispered, "Come on, come back, you are not done yet. I did not come all this way for you to quit on me now." At 138 seconds, Nix's heart restarted. The monitoring crystals exploded back to life with light, and the vital signs climbed, and Nix took a breath, a real breath, deep and full, and the pavilion erupted in sounds that Lena barely heard because she was already moving back to the surgical site to close. The final wound. She worked for another 40 minutes, suturing with hands that had begun to tremble, now that the adrenaline was fading, and when she placed the last stitch, she stepped back from the table, and pulled off her gloves, and sat down heavily in a chair that someone pushed behind her. Her hands were shaking, and her scrubs were soaked with sweat, and there were tears on her face that she did not remember crying. But on the cushion in front of her, Nix was breathing, slow and steady and strong, and the bioluminescent glands along its spine were beginning to glow again, faintly, like stars coming back to life after a long darkness. The Empress approached. The cracks in her crystalline skin were already beginning to close, the pale light receding, the fractures healing in real time as the psychic bond with Nix stabilized and strengthened. She stood before Lena, this towering monarch of 40 star systems, and she looked at the small human woman, sitting in the chair, with shaking hands, and when she spoke, her voice broke like glass in the rain. "Why?" she asked. "Why did you come when no one else would?" Lena looked up at the Empress, exhausted beyond words, her eyes red, her body spent, and she said the only thing that had ever been true. "Because where I come from, you do not let a cat die alone." The creature opened its eyes, both of them glowing again with that warm bioluminescent light that the Velithi poets compared to captured moonlight, and the first thing it did was yawn, showing every one of its tiny sharp teeth, and then it stretched all 6 of its legs one at a time, with the slow and deliberate satisfaction of an animal that had decided the universe still owed it comfort. The second thing it did was look around the recovery room for Lena. The Empress noticed this, and she would later tell her court that she was not jealous, and no one in the court believed her. Lena had barely left the recovery room in 3 days, sleeping in a chair beside Nix's cushion, waking every few hours to check vitals and adjust medication, and make small notes in a file she had titled Patient Nix, Species Space Cat, Official Classification Pending, which made Desh laugh every time he saw it. When Nix finally stood up on its own, wobbly at first, then steadier, testing each repaired leg with the cautious dignity of a creature that refused to look weak, Lena knelt on the floor and held out her hand. Nix walked to her and headbutted her palm. Then it climbed into her lap, circled 3 times in the universal language of cats, settling into a spot they have claimed, and fell asleep purring so loudly that the monitoring crystals vibrated. Lena sat very still, afraid to move, and smiled the kind of smile that comes from a place deeper than happiness, from a place where a 12-year-old girl still stood on a lawn, watching a house burn, and wondering if she could have done more. She had done more. She had crossed the stars and done more. The Empress entered the recovery room an hour later and found Lena still sitting on the floor with Nix in her lap. And for a long moment, the most powerful being in the galaxy simply stood in the doorway and watched a human woman hold her cat. "Cats are good judges of character," Lena replied. The Empress sat down on the floor across from Lena, an act so far beneath royal protocol that her advisors would have fainted if they had seen it. And she reached out and stroked Nix's fur, and the creature purred louder. "I am going to name you a friend of the throne," the Empress said. "It is a title that has never been given to a non-Vilathy in the history of the hegemony." "That is very kind, Your Majesty, but I really just—" "It is not a request, Dr. Vasquez." Lena paused, then nodded, and Nix purred, and for a moment the 3 of them sat together on the floor of the recovery room, in a silence that was warm and full and needed no words. The news spread across the galaxy like light from a new star. Every holo network, every data stream, every communication channel in the Concord carried the story. The alien monarch's dying cat, the refusals, the human veterinarian who crossed 3 star systems in a patched-up medical frigate and saved the creature's life with her bare hands and a surgical plan based on house cat medicine. The reactions were immediate and varied, and in many cases unprecedented. The Galari Hive Collective issued what their translators described as a formal acknowledgement of error, which was the closest the Galari had ever come to an apology in their entire recorded history. And within a week, the collective quietly submitted a request to the Human Veterinary Medical Database for full access to Terran animal treatment protocols, and the request was granted, and Galari bioengineers began studying the human-animal bond with the intense focus they usually reserve for hive architecture. The Draloon were affected most deeply. Thessaly, the empath who had refused to treat Nix because its mind was too chaotic, had felt Lena's emotional state during the surgery from across the galaxy, and what she had experienced haunted her in the most beautiful way. She told the Draloon Communion that the human woman had been terrified the entire time. Not just nervous, not just stressed, but genuinely, deeply afraid. And yet she had kept going, kept working, kept talking to the dying creature in a calm voice, as if her hands were not shaking and her heart was not breaking. "We refused because we were afraid of the chaos in the creature's mind," Thessaly said. "The human was afraid too, but she did it anyway. That is the difference. That is what makes them what they are." The Draloons sent a formal delegation to Earth within the month. Not diplomats or politicians, but scientists and philosophers who wanted to study the bond between humans and their companion animals. Because the Draloon had never encountered anything like it in the galaxy. This ancient partnership between a predator species and the smaller creatures it had chosen to love instead of eat. They spent a year on Earth, visiting animal shelters and veterinary clinics and homes where old women talked to their cats as if they were people, and dogs waited by the door for owners who would never come home. And when the Draloon delegation returned to their homeworld, they published a report that became the most widely read document in their civilization's history. Its title, roughly translated, was The Impossible Kindness: How Humans Learned to Love What They Did Not Need to Love. The Torvasians handled things in their own way. The lead statistician, who had watched Lena's survival probability climb during the surgery, published a paper that sent shockwaves through the entire Torvasian academic establishment. It was titled Irrational Persistence as a Survival Strategy, a case study in human decision-making, and its central argument, supported by data from the surgery and dozens of other cases the Torvasians had quietly been collecting, was that humans routinely achieved outcomes that probability models said were impossible, not because they were lucky or because the models were wrong, but because humans simply refused to accept the math. The paper concluded with a statement that was, by Torvasian standards, deeply emotional. The human variable cannot be predicted because it is not rational. It is something else, something our models have no term for, and its consistent presence in human behavior suggests it is not a flaw, but a feature, perhaps the most significant feature of their species. The Torvasians did not have a word for what they were describing. Humans did. They called it love. 6 weeks after the surgery, the Empress convened a special session of the Galactic Concord's Inner Council, the governing body of the most powerful species in known space, and she proposed something that had never been done before. She proposed that humanity be granted a full seat on the Inner Council. The response was immediate. Outrage from several delegations. Humanity was too young, too primitive, too recently arrived. Species normally waited centuries for a seat on the Inner Council, and humans had been part of the Concord for barely a decade. The Empress let them argue for exactly 4 minutes before she stood, and the room fell silent. Because when Salith Kovan stood, the galaxy paid attention. Every species in this room was contacted when my companion was dying, she said, her voice carrying the weight of crystal and starlight. Every one of you had the power to help, and every one of you chose not to. She paused and let the silence do its work. The humans came, not because they were ordered to, not because they wanted power or favor or status. They came because a living creature was suffering, and they could not bear to do nothing. A single woman on a broken ship crossed 3 star systems because she could not stand the thought of a cat dying alone. Around the council chamber, and her eyes burned. Any species that would do that has earned the right to sit in this room and help decide the fate of the living. The vote passed, not unanimously. The Torvasians abstained on principle because they said they needed more data. But it passed, and humanity took its seat among the great civilizations of the galaxy, not because of military power, or technological achievement, or economic influence, but because of a veterinarian and a cat. Lena did not attend the ceremony. She was already gone, back on the Florence, back to her rounds, treating sick animals on cargo ships, and frontier stations, and colony worlds where the nearest proper veterinary clinic was 3 star systems away. She pinned a small hollow image to the wall of her surgical bay, next to the old photograph of an orange tabby named Miso that she had carried with her since she was 12. The hollow showed Nyx, fully healed, fur gleaming, all 6 legs working perfectly, bioluminescent eyes blazing with warm light, curled up on the Empress's lap during a council session, fast asleep and purring. Desh found her staring at it one evening and asked if she was okay. "I am fine," she said, and she meant it in a way she had not meant it in a very long time. On a distant colony world, months later, a young Violithi girl sat in front of a holoscreen, watching a documentary about the event that the Concord media had titled The Surgery That Changed the Galaxy. She watched the footage of Lena kneeling on the floor and scratching behind Nyx's ears, and the footage of the 7-hour surgery, and the footage of the Empress weeping in the pavilion. And when the documentary was over, she turned to her parent with wide crystalline eyes. "What makes humans so different?" she asked. Her parent was quiet for a long time, thinking carefully, because the Vielethi did not give simple answers to important questions. But this time the answer was simple. "They are the only species in the galaxy," her parents said, "that looked at the stars and brought their animals with them." Far away, on a small ship with a patched hull and engines that sounded mostly fine, a human woman prepared for another surgery on another creature that needed help. And she worked with steady hands and a full heart. And she did not know that the galaxy would never be the same because of what she had done. But Nyx knew. And somewhere in a floating palace above a city of light, a small six-legged creature with fur like midnight and eyes like captured moons purred in the lap of an empress and dreamed of the woman who had brought it back from the dark.